Okay, I'm still sat here in the lovely Cambridge with Dr Beth Singler, a postdoctoral researcher here at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. Last time I interviewed you, this was a couple of years ago I think, in a very noisy cafe in Cambridge. It wasn't that great quality video. You were doing your research on Indigo Children.
Yes.
And you talk about what Indigo Children are and the kind of culture. But what you weren't able to tell me because you haven't found out yet was what happened to them, what the findings of your research were and things. So I wonder what point you reached by the end of that project.
I think lots of different points. There's gonna be a whole book of points at some point. It's been accepted by the publishers, so that'll be coming along. I think some of the most interesting things I discovered by interacting with the Indigo Children was how diverse the idea was. That bounding the idea was actually quite difficult because it had so many different versions and iterations. And I think I said something in the last video about the numbers of types I was discovering.
Yeah, there wasn't just this one idea.
No, it's quite broad and it's interpreted in lots of different ways. Something else I may have mentioned last time, I don't know, is its intersection with hip hop culture and how the creative forms interplay between both of them. So my book now will have like a whole chapter on its intersection with hip hop culture, which forms something that they sometimes refer to as indigoism rather than just Indigo Children. So sort of a mixture of spirituality with some sort of activist dialogue as well. It's very interesting.
And that's quite in opposition to the stereotypes that people have of Indigo Children as kind of 60s, 70s, wishy-washy, New Age liberals do think their children are better than everybody else's because of some star-seeding thing. That's actually got much more of a the right way to put it, much more kind of a contemporary feel, I guess, and it's like that's something where the people who identified as Indigo Children have taken on themselves and done something different with it, I guess.
Yeah, I think there is a strong call to activism broadly amongst the Indigo Children. Well, I think pointing out this occurrence of it within hip hop culture was important because some of the demographic work on the New Age is really kind of limited, and I do go into this in my book that it characterises the New Ager as well female, white, middle class, educated to a certain level, and I think there's incidences of New Age thought and using the Indigo Child as a frame for that appearing in so many different areas, and partly that characterisation is limited because people aren't paying attention to what's happening on social media, which was kind of primary route for me into to finding out about the Indigo Children and seeing where they were, what they were discussing, the kind of art forms they were creating. It's quite a material religion in a sense that they do create poetry and music, and that certainly overlaps with various genres of music.
I think that's really kind of interesting. So when I first talk to students about the New Age, they absolutely lean on that stereotype, and why wouldn't they? Because they've been fed it most of their lives. It's not really their fault. But they talk of mostly women, mostly of a certain age, mostly of a certain interest, and living in certain places like Stroud or Glastonbury, or that kind of version or that kind of theme park version of New Ageism.
Absolutely,
I guess. So the Indigo Children thing, which you might think actually, to someone who didn't know much about it like me, I would think is firmly in the middle of that stereotype. It turns out that it's actually a key to thinking about some more diverse forms and ways in which New Age thought has sought expression, I guess, in the last 30 years or so.
Yeah, it's much more diverse, and yet the media representation, when it is very rarely represented in the media, is still the white woman of a certain age. So an Indigo Child turned up on Holby City once during my research, which I was very excited about.
Yeah, of course.
But she was in her mid-late 30s. I don't want to be rude to the actress, I'm not very good at judging ages, but she was mid-late 30s, had always been treated as special by her parents, thought she was special, she had a heart complaint, and fit all the sort of New Agey stereotypes.
I wonder if there's a real tendency or a temptation for us to see Indigo Children and people with an interest in creativity and spirituality that way anyway, because there's this kind of, I think, rather problematic cultural trope that's very common at the moment, this idea of snowflakes of a generation of young people who were always treated as special.
Yes.
And there's a real kind of, we see it on kind of in right-wing politics particularly, there's a real kickback against that, you're not special kind of thing. So I wonder if the kind of Indigo Children movement is a bit of a victim of that and its kind of portrayal.
There's certainly an element of that. I spoke to the writer of the Holby City episodes, and he'd come across the idea because a yoga teacher of his wife's his wife's yoga teacher had talked about his child as being special, and he sort of thought it was an interesting idea of how we speak children as special. There is certainly an element of that still, and that is one of the primary criticisms of the Indigo Child idea. But there's so much more going on with it. It ties into activism, like I've said, prophecy, intentions for the future, utopianism. It's not simply people looking at their children and calling them special. It's people redefining themselves often. Actually, most of the people I spoke to were adults, or adults talking about their children. Finding an identity that matches what they already think of themselves, which is quite a common trope in lots of different groups, sort of nostalgia for a sense of self, and then finding a name for it online.
And you find kind of secular versions of that, and people's membership of, when it's the internet, and people's membership of subcultural movements, various sorts, some of which are music based, some of which are identity based, some which are kind of region based. So the idea of belief ones isn't hugely elite, just that it comes out earlier than most of the others.
I see Indigo Children with online profiles that contain all those elements. So there'll be an Indigo Child or a Star Child or whatever, but also a Sagittarian, Hufflepuff, INFJ, all the various ways of self-identifying coming together. And I think that's an interesting trend to unpick, and the Indigo Child is one way into that as well. Yeah,
it's very much part of that kind of idea of not 1990s identity politics, but a kind of 21st century kind of self-identification process. It's rather kind of interesting, I think. It's something that I think isn't limited to Indigo Children. Hearing you talk about it, the bit I think that still looks like a thread that hasn't got lost from that earlier version of thinking of Indigo Children is creativity.
Yes.
It looks as if that's almost like a non-negotiable aspect of Indigo Children, is the sense in which people identify themselves as either creative or aspiring towards creativity, or even just valuing the importance of creativity.
Yes, absolutely. And I think going back slightly to identity politics, it's very easy, I think, for people to assume that's only a product of the left. So equally, just as people put on their profile that they're Hufflepuff and they're Indigo Children, there's the right-wing version of that as well, which I don't do research into, but that same self-identifying through labels is quite common on both sides of the ideological division.
I think everyone didn't know anything about it. Was I looked at people spend an hour looking at people's Twitter biographies. You've only got a few words, and everyone labels are handy, and they think I'm this and this, I'm this supporter, and I hashtag this support wherever the country they feel marks them out. Whether if they put hashtag support Israel, support Palestine, it not only says they technically support it put a whole swathe of other associations are kind of set off by it.
And there's been lots of discussion about the social media bubble lately, and how that kind of self-labelling and the kind of the networks that you build on social media puts you into that communication bubble.
I'm always kind of interested in that. In some form of social media it does, but it also gives you the potential to encounter people from absolute opposite ones in ways you never would as well. So it's a kind of interesting kind of both the bubble, but there's an intersection before we get into Venn diagrams and bubbles.
If you're an exploratory type person, you would probably spend more time reaching outside of that bubble that you formed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's sometimes, apart from it's bad for our mental health, to be exposed to too much extreme material, but often in some cases I think it's useful for people to go beyond their bubble and kind of have a sense of what lies beyond. Well, thank you. That's given me a really good sense of kind of some of the directions you went into, some of the diversity. I guess the only real answer is to wait and read your book.
Yes, read the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.